This is Ron Kelleher with the Inspired Leadership Podcast, episode number 518. Today's episode is entitled, Should Christian Leaders Be Prepared to Respond to Persecution Today?
Hello, and welcome to Inspired Leadership, the podcast for Christian leaders in the marketplace who want to be the best leaders they can be. And now your host, Ron Kelleher.
In your role as a Christian leader, have you endured some form of persecution? Now, I'm not talking about the kind of persecution Jesus endured or about Paul, who was beaten with rods and whips, but have you been subjected to modern-day persecution? These days, persecution of Christians takes many forms. Christians have been denied jobs and services in restaurants because of their faith, as well as advancement opportunities at work. And sadly, because of their faith, Christians are commonly the targets of bullying on social media. Recently, I was the target of a vicious attack on social media. I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it, but I was unprepared for the persecution and didn't handle it as well as I would have liked. I was in a private Facebook group devoted to business topics when someone asked about something in the news that day, and I responded to the question with a faith-based opinion. It took seconds for the hate and vitriol to start rolling in. Within minutes, a mob of anti-Christians threatened me via cyberspace. Their goal was to cancel me and my business and run me out of town, as it were. I was so surprised and unprepared for the attack that rather than courageously defend my biblical position, I sheepishly left the group, never to return. I wish I had had the presence of mind at that moment to recall Peter's advice to fellow believers as he warned them to be prepared to suffer for their faith. Peter began his instruction by saying that believers should not repay evil for evil or insult with insult, but with a blessing. With that as the foundation, Peter describes in 1 Peter 3:13-17 how believers should behave in the face of persecution. First, he talks about zeal. In verses 3:13 and 14, he says, "Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you suffer for what is right, you are blessed." The first step in dealing with persecution is to be eager to do what is good. The word eager there is better translated as zealous. We should zealously pursue what is right and good. Sadly, some Christians with weak values have a could-care-less attitude toward doing what is right and good. Others have a selfish attitude. They'll do what is right and good if it benefits them, and some have a false attitude. As such, they profess to believe in doing what is right and good publicly, but privately, they do what they want. Next, Peter tells us that believers who zealously do what is right and good are less likely to suffer persecution, but if we suffer persecution for what is doing good and right, we will be blessed by God. So number 2 is about dedication in verse 15. He writes, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord." The second step in dealing with persecution is to fill and focus our hearts on Christ. The greatest of all hopes, our hope in salvation, lies in our faith that Jesus promises as the Son of God. The light and momentary trials of this world should never be so great that we would deny Him. Only through our dedication to Him, through faith, can we stand firm against persecution. Number 3 in verse 15 is about witnessing. Peter writes, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." So the third step in dealing with persecution is always be prepared to explain our faith with gentleness and respect. First, note that we must be prepared. Now, that means that we need to be ready ahead of time. We must know why we believe what we believe, and we must be able to articulate the reason for our faith in Christ. And second, we must be prepared to answer everyone. That means friends, foes, strangers, employees, and coworkers. Everyone. Finally, we must be able to explain our faith with a spirit of gentleness and respect. Number 4 is about conscience. In verses 16 to 17, Peter writes, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for what is doing good than for doing evil. The final step in dealing with persecution is for the believer to have and keep a clear conscience before God. That means our walk must match our talk. The fruit of the Spirit that Paul describes in Galatians 5:22 and 3, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, they must be alive and active in our lives. The righteous behavior of the believer will vindicate them in this world and the next. It's better for the believer to bear up under persecution, keeping a clear conscience before God, than to fall away from God and follow the evil of this world. So what is our response to persecution? Well, Peter intentionally offered these instructions about preparing for and responding to persecution. He begins by saying we must zealously do what is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. Next, we must fill our hearts with Christ and his promise of salvation. Then, with our hearts full of the Spirit of God, we must be prepared to share our faith humbly and respectfully with anyone who asks. And finally, our actions must always reflect our faith in Christ in a way that brings honor and glory to him. Living zealously for Christ may invite persecution, but in the end, it's more important for the believer to live according to God's principles and be willing to share our hope in God with others than to concern ourselves with the possibility of persecution that might come our way in this world. I'm reminded again of Jesus' admonition in Matthew 5:16. Jesus says, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." As believers, we must let our light shine before men, even in the face of persecution from the world. Well, that's it for this week, and as always, questions and comments are welcome. Have you endured persecution because of your faith? And if so, how did you deal with it? I'd love it if you'd come over to the website at ronkelleher.com/episode 518 and leave me a question or a comment. And as always, before we go, I'd like to ask you to do me a quick favor. That is to hop on over to whatever podcast service you're listening to this on. Leave a ranking for the show and a comment if you wish. It does help us get the show into the hands of more and more people. So I thank you in advance for that and pray that God would help us all to be the powerful and the inspired leaders he intends us to be. That's it for this episode of Inspired Leadership. You'll find a complete transcript of this episode on my website at www.ronkelleher.com. My prayer now is that you'll go out and be the powerful, inspired leader